Rome wasn't built in a day, but if its punishments were meted out at the same pace, it would have been demolished in just as many days. From punishing criminals with crucifixion and throwing them to their death from great heights, to casting people in bronze, not to mention having live birds pecking out their eyes. There is no denying that the Romans really knew how to make an example of someone. And if you think that these examples were brutal enough, stay tuned, because today we are going to talk about one of the most frightening ones yet. One of the more gruesome punishments that the Romans handed out was sewing people up inside the carcass of a dead animal. Now, we don't know exactly when this practice started or why it became so popular, but we do know that it was still around during the rule of Nero, who was emperor of Rome from 54 to 68 AD. This means that it could have been used as early as the founding of the Roman Empire, because we have found evidence of the practice in artwork from the time of Augustus, who was the first emperor of Rome. But it was definitely still around during the reign of Nero. During his time, there was a famous case where a woman named Acta was accused of killing her husband and children and then trying to kill her nurse and servants, too. According to the story, Acta had made a big life insurance policy out on her husband, and she had taken out much smaller policies on her kids. She was hoping to cash in on all three, but the suspicious deaths raised the suspicion of the authorities, and after questioning the staff, they found out that the only reason that the nurse and servants were still alive was because they had been out at the time of the incident. In response, they were given a noble reward for their good behavior, and although Acta herself was spared, she was sentenced to the ultimate humiliation, being sewn up in the body of a dead donkey. There are many other stories like this one that show how widespread the practice of sewing people up inside of animals was, but sadly, most of what we know about this comes from the writings of the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote about the cruelty of Nero. Roland seemed to delight in painting a picture of him as an awful ruler. So while it may seem like this happened a lot, it's possible that he might have exaggerated the number of times that it happened. Either way, the practice was real, and we have physical evidence of it today. There have been several pieces of art found that depict this punishment happening. A fresco in the Roman Villa of Mysteries shows a woman being sewn up in the belly of a fish, and another piece of artwork found in Pompeii shows a man being sewn up in the body of a horse. We also have written accounts of the punishment from Pliny the Younger, a Roman writer and philosopher who described how a criminal was stitched up inside the belly of a pig. Although these accounts tell us a lot about the punishment itself, they don't necessarily tell us why the Romans used this kind of punishment, especially since it didn't actually kill the person. We do know that most of the time the people who were given this sentence were unnecessarily those who deserved death, but were instead given this punishment because their crime was seen as shameful. In the case of Acta, for instance, she had killed her own husband, which was seen as a very shameful thing to do back then. Plus, she had tried to get rid of her children, too, which made things even worse. Her punishment had to be something that would make the people watching understand just how horrible her actions were, and that leads us to believe that the main purpose of sewing people up in animals was humiliation. After all, the Romans wouldn't just put the person inside the animal and let them die. Most of the time they would leave them in places where people could see them, and the sight of someone rotting away inside of an animal carcass was meant to be terrifying. And that's not even the worst part. Usually, the person would be sewn up inside the carcass of a dead donkey, and there's a specific reason for that, because donkeys were seen as stupid and stubborn animals. And by sewing the person up inside of a donkey, it was like saying that they were too stupid to realize the error of their ways, and that they were too stubborn to admit guilt or remorse. It was also said that the use of a donkey was to remind the condemned of how they had brayed and begged for mercy before their sentence was carried out. Sewing someone up inside a donkey carcass was quite possibly the worst thing that could happen to you in ancient Rome. But if you ask me, I think it was probably pretty scary no matter what animal it was. Being sewn up inside of a dead animal, regardless of whether it was a fish, a horse, a pig, or a donkey, would have been horrifying. You'd be trapped inside a dead body, unable to move or escape, and then be left out in the open where anyone could see you. It doesn't matter if you committed the crime that you were punished for or not, because everyone watching would assume that you did. At that point, you have no choice but to play along if you want to survive. Even though you can't escape, your mind will try to come up with creative ways to free itself from this situation, but you won't be able to move. So you'll be stuck thinking these thoughts until you run out of air to breathe. But one thing that we should ask ourselves is, what would the person do to escape? Maybe they'll try to break out of their prison by clawing and biting at the skin of the dead animal. That might work for a bit, but eventually their strength will start to fade as they become weaker and weaker. So then they'll have to deal with the fact that they're slowly suffocating and there's nothing that they can do about it. What if instead, they try to calm themselves down and ration their oxygen supply? They might be able to make this last longer, but it probably won't help them in the long run. Eventually, their bodies will start to shut down, and they'll drift off to sleep. The next thing they'll know, they'll be in a place with no pain and no suffering. In a way, the person will have gotten everything they wished for. They won't be able to harm anyone ever again, and they won't feel anything. However, everyone watching will be disappointed because this means that they and get to see the next part of the punishment, which is the most important part. Those who were sewn up inside dead animals were always left in public squares, left to rot. but they were usually put there with the expectation that they would last for a few days. During that time, the condemned would be exposed to the elements, meaning that rain, snow, and wind would pummel their already torn and decaying flesh. On top of that, if there was one thing worse than the elements, it was the insects. If you've ever seen a fly land on a piece of rotting meat, then you know how annoying they can be. Now imagine being trapped inside of a dead animal carcass with hundreds of flies crawling all over you. Some might try to eat away at your flesh, while others might lay eggs right on your body. Then once those eggs hatch, you'll have to listen to the sound of their tiny legs as they crawl all over you. The whole time you're trapped in there, you'll have to smell the stench of decay as bacteria, fungi, and parasites slowly take over your body. People watching this unfold before their eyes would have likely felt a mixture of emotions, including disgust and fear. But for the condemned, it would have been unbearable. So now we know why the Romans used this punishment, but we still have one question left. How is this even done? You might think that they would have simply sewed the person up inside the animal's body, but that wouldn't have worked, because they would have eventually suffocated. Instead, the person would have been thrown inside of the animal's cavity, which would be large enough for them to move around a little bit. And once they were in there, the opening would be blocked with wood and stones. But air would still be able to pass through, meaning that the condemned would still be able to breathe. Once this was done, the person would then be covered in wax, which would prevent any insects from getting in. Then finally, the whole thing would be sewn together. Although the person would still be alive, they would have no idea what was going on around them. They would have been trapped in complete darkness with only the sounds of the world to let them know what was happening. If you were ever to find yourself in this situation, what would you do? Would you scream as loud as you can and hope that someone hears you? Or would you try to calm yourself down and take deep breaths? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And while you're at it, don't forget to like and subscribe so that we can keep making videos like this for you.